collect gathering, right? And we've got another problem in that the Zoom link is not functioning at the moment because the actual link hasn't arrived in the right place. So if any folks get in touch with you to say what on earth's going on, we're very, very sorry. The lecture will be recorded and will go out on the internet in due course. So that's the first thing to say. I've lost my bit of paper already. Right, well, Philip was going to give the announcements about how Zoom people could take part, so I'm afraid that's off the record at the moment. Housekeeping in general, if you haven't found them already, the toilets are just outside. These days they're labelled up. For shortly after we opened, they didn't bother to label them. It was a bit confusing. Anytime you need to get out, if the outer doors are secured, as they will be from about 7:15, press the green button. That's to let you through the inside. If anybody has problems with dazzling by the lights, do come and say. We can play around with it. I don't think it's a problem at the moment, but it does happen sometimes. Philip, the fire.
Yes. Is this? Yes, it's working. If there's some sort of emergency, a fire or something like that, then there should be some sort of verbal announcement. I think it's a female voice comes on first of all to say there's a problem, and if a male voice comes on later saying please evacuate, then follow the green fire exit signs or follow me, or well, normally it's straight out there the way you came in. If there's a problem with that, then there's another way out right up in the top corner there. So I think that's the main things you need to know.
Thank you. Right, moving on to tonight's speaker. Dr. Jonathan Berg, an accomplished writer on scientific areas, extensive scientific publications. He edited the monthly magazine ACB News for 28 years. He's also written National Health Service and commercial reports. In his personal life, he's published 5 editions of Positively Birmingham, a best-selling book about the modern city. He runs part-time walking tour business, which raises funds for local charities supporting street dwellers, but of course at the moment that's a bit in abeyance because of coronavirus problems. Tonight he's going to speak to us about the invention of electroplating and its commercialisation in the jewellery quarter. So I think we'll hand over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening. It's very nice to be here and speak to you for the next 50 minutes or so. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about something that I've been thinking about in Birmingham for many, many years and trying to rediscover. And that's the work of the Elkington cousins who came to Birmingham back in the from the 1800s, really. First of all, though, a little bit about myself. I had a career in the health service in pathology. I ended up as the pathology director at City and Samwell hospitals. That's part of my Sandwell empire there, the sample bench. 25 people booking in samples as fast as they can in the early to mid-afternoon as the runs come back from GPs. In my spare time, my hobbies included photography and, as was said, editing, and also I got into local publishing. I used to cycle to work. It's a long way from Alton to Samwell Hospital on a bicycle along the canals, 13 miles. And I was pretty fit, actually. I was doing 5,000 or 6,000 miles a year if I cycled every day, as I used to try and do. And here, as you get skirt round the city centre, very close to here, a morning reflection, Ashted Tunnel, as you're going round past here and Aston University. And if you care to take a bit of time to look around, then you see things that are quite amazing in our city. The Horsley Ironworks, Staffordshire, 1828. A lot of our bridges across the canals date from around about that time and are in amazing condition. Relics of the pre-Victorian age, our Georgian canal system. And being a bit of a photographer sometimes, maybe on the way between one hospital and the other hospital with a camera in the backpack, you can play around and get some nice photography. And you can look and understand a little bit more about the canals if you care to stop and think. And here, the top of the wrought iron ironworks bridge, a cut mark made by the rope or steel hawsers as they pull the boats along with the cart horses. So I produced some books of the city, mainly because there wasn't one. The first book I produced was called Positively Birmingham. It's just sold out over the last few months in its 5th edition, sold about 40,000 copies in hardback, which isn't bad really, for a book that when I went to a London publisher and said, I've spent 3 years doing the photography and text for a book which is one citizen's view of the place he came to live in 1978. And the publisher looked at me and said, Jonathan, there's a reason why there's not a book of modern Birmingham. No one would buy that. So Barbara and I self-published it. I started a little publishing company that still goes today. And you know what? It sold out in 9 months. With the help of Sir Richard Knowles, actually, who was the Lord Mayor at the time and kindly did the foreword and granted a civic reception for it. And then made sure that the Lord Mayor's office gave it to everybody and anybody. And then the following year, I decided that we needed a little tourist guide. And again, people said, well, you're not going to do very well with that because there aren't any tourists. But there were tourists. And Discovering Birmingham, again, now is in its 5th edition, the book on the right-hand side on the picture. But, you know, there's a backstory to Birmingham wherever you look. And when I was writing and taking photos for Positively Birmingham, I went to the jewellery quarter. I went and met people that today are today's jewellers. I looked at their history. I looked at the Museum of the Jewellery Quarter run by Birmingham Museums and Art Galleries. And of course, they featured in pages of lovely photos. But I remember going down Newell Street and trying to work out, you know, where was this firm Elkington? And I sort of just about realised it was the soon-to-close Museum of Industry in Newell Street. And I went in there and I took pictures of the artefacts in there. And a curator kindly told me, I think it might have been Jim actually, that you know what, if you go to the back, you'll see some of the original parts of the Elkington factory that haven't been knocked down. So we'll look at that in the next few minutes. I am working on a new book, actually, that one on the bottom right there, Birmingham's Public Art. It's supposed to be coming out next November. We will see. So coming up to retirement, my staff said to me, Jonathan, you won't do very well in retirement because you've spent the last 20 years fighting for money from chief executives, encouraging your MSc and PhD students, and generally just trying to keep the ship afloat in difficult times in the health service. Of course, the health services times are always difficult. And coming up to retirement, I realized there was an opportunity to set up some walking tours of the city, which we called after the name of the first book, Positively Birmingham Walking Tours. And we decided to raise money for SIFA Fireside that does help street dwellers in Birmingham. And you know what? We've raised over £25,000 now for them, giving away a deal of the profits of the little Saturday and Sunday tours. And we've ended up with a bunch of tours. And the one we're going to look at now is the one on the left-hand side in the middle, Discovering Birmingham. The walking tours have an eclectic group of people, from Polish students to inward investors to all sorts of groups, art societies, just down to the general public that want to do something on a Saturday and Sunday afternoon when they find themselves on a mini break in the city. And the Sunday tour, Discovering Birmingham, was going to go from the library, well, it does go from the Library of Birmingham down what we call the secret canal to the Jewellery Quarter, and then it explains how that place started from fields with a family that had decided to cash in and move to London, away from the city where they made all their money. And then we see how several inventions went to world domination. It was so exciting to tell that story. And as I told it, I realized the sort of corporate history side of Birmingham, people had forgotten half the things we do. You probably know that the motto for Birmingham is forward. But occasionally, you do have to remember your roots as you go forward, because in actual fact, what you're founded on helps you to move forward appropriately. So we started that walk about 5 years ago now, and that's the first ever walk on a Sunday afternoon. And as I got into it, I started exploring more. And when we get to this bit of the Paisley and Birmingham Canal, I sort of realized that the architects, to make their life easy with Birmingham City Council's planning department, had modelled these new flats on the old factory that was there before. How could you not get planning permission if it was looking identical to the thing that we knocked down some 50 years ago? So that is a modern time picture of the Elkington factory site. Both sides of the canal and the bit that goes over the Newell Street tunnel. A huge factory. I spent 3 years writing a book about it. The book's available. It came out last year, and you can buy it on the internet quite easily from any internet provider. Let's look at how the book tells the story. The background to Birmingham's industrial heritage, or one of its backgrounds, is the toy-making industry. Toys, the original name for toys, Birmingham toys, small leather, ceramic, or increasingly, as we move from medieval times towards the Georgian period, small metal items. But not just any old metal. They mixed together in crucibles in the early days, different metals, to get the material they needed for the different things they wanted to manufacture. So if you want hardened steel, you added carbon to iron. If you wanted something that was malleable, you added copper and different metals to make alloys such as brass and bronze. How do we know all this? Well, you know, as we redevelop this city, which we continuously do, because that's what Birmingham does, we do now at least do archaeological digs to try and understand more about our past. And here's the archaeological dig in 2003, one of a number around the Bullring shopping centre. And if you look at the reports from those digs, you'll see now direct evidence that we were mixing together in crucibles different metals back to the 13th and 14th centuries. By the time you get to the Georgian period, we had hundreds of years of experience of working in metal industries. In particular, we were the world leaders of making small items out of metal. And here's some examples. Different types of buttons, some very expensive, gold-plated, some very ordinary. Buckles, some in silver, some in brass. We were the world's biggest manufacturer of these items, coming up to a period where the whole of Europe wanted to adorn themselves, show that they were middle classes that were going somewhere, and Birmingham could do very well. And if we look at an early pioneer who came to Birmingham from Wolverley near Worcester, look at John Baskerville. Bit of a lad, John Baskerville. Not everybody's person you'd necessarily socialise with. A very interesting character in his personal life. Didn't quite marry his housekeeper for a long time because she wasn't actually divorced. But he came to Birmingham as a sign writer. He worked down near Moore Street Station, very close to here. And we think he actually might have taught Matthew Bolton a little bit. And then he saw other people doing things in Birmingham that he thought he could do as well. In particular, the Japanning industry. We remember him with the beautiful piece of public art, one of few remaining from the original 1990s, Centenary Square, Industry and Genius. And of course, Industry and Genius doesn't show the typeface enlarged of the Baskerville type. It shows the punches that made the type. So those punches there, to the size of the font you want to make, and I'd suggest to that size, you would punch into a flat sheet of copper. And in the indentation made, you would put your molten lead, and then out you would pick that typeface and put it on your letterpress. After Baskerville, once we get to the 1750s and 60s, we see that explosion in Birmingham of industry as people like Matthew Bolton and James Watt took the hundreds of years of experience and said, you know what, we're going to go big with this. So Matthew Bolton's dad handed a factory, the small factory, maybe with a dozen outworkers close to what's now Snow Hill Station, over to his son, said, son, it's still a family business, but you do with it what you may. I guess it's a family business, so Matthew Bolton Sr. will be sitting in the rocking chair, still counting the profit. And Matthew went off, as I'm sure you know, to just the other side of today's jewellery quarter, to where we had the Hockley Brook with a water wheel and built the world's first factory. 1,000 staff, 12 different business partners doing all sorts of different things. Fine ormolu, buttons, buckles, you name it, he was doing it. And of course, for the last 30 years, the Soho Mint was making coins for the world. And we remember them today. We call them the Golden Boys, don't we? They're back in Centenary Square. Bolton, the originator, the entrepreneur, we tend to portray him as James Watt, who came and said, hey, your water wheel's rubbish. Fancy a good new steam engine where I'm actually not losing 70% of the energy every time the piston goes up and down because I've got a separate cylinder to do my condensing. And yeah, let's do that. Bring one down. Let's take out a patent in 1775 and for 25 years have the world rights to improved steam engines. And of course, the third guy there on the right, William Murdoch, who was sent down to Red Roof for 20 years or so, he helped install those steam engines as one of their head engineers. Tad boring in the winter, red roof, you know. And Murdoch was a bit of an inventor as well. So he invented, well, let's invent town gas. We could do with that back again at the moment, couldn't we? And, he said, getting stuff around the factory. Let's invent the pneumatic tube system. I installed one of those in Samwell Hospital in the 1980s to get all my samples back into the lab from the wards. So that was down to William Murdoch. We need a realistic appraisal of these gentlemen, though, and they were all gentlemen, because as well as doing these amazing things, they were very intricately involved with the slave trade. The Industrial Revolution in Birmingham, it's as far as you can get from Bristol, Liverpool and London, that starting point for the triangle we all learnt at school. But of course, if you went down to Bristol docks or up to Liverpool docks, 50% of the cargo was guns made in Birmingham. And the first coins that were made at the Soho Mint, the first coinage was for Sumatra, a slave trading island. So when we do walking tours of Birmingham now, and we look at the real Birmingham family, a beautiful phosphor bronze statue outside the library, 2 females, 2 sons, 1 pregnant, of the sisters, and no father figure. And the Evening Mail says, disgraceful, what a controversial statue. And then we go to the Golden Boys, and we go, here we are, non-controversial. Not anymore. This is just as controversial. But it hasn't got tipped into the canal yet, not like the floating harbour in Bristol's tipping in event a year or 2 ago. And hopefully it won't be, because of course, we should tell our history in full and keep our statues to help us do that. The Lunar Society, I'm sure you all know, they had a mixture of interests. They met often at Soho House, that amazing place we can all go and visit. And look at the table that's come back, the actual table they sat around. These were some of the trays they had. They had multidisciplinary teams, something that if you've worked in the health service, we know about. We bring different skills together around the table to help the patients in hospitals, MDTs, and they were doing the same in the Lunar Society. They moved fast. They didn't necessarily give their secrets of their chosen industries or professions away around the table, but where it was useful to others, they helped them. Josiah Wedgwood would say, you're bringing in a lot of stuff from the Black Country. On the roads, you're having a laugh. Build some canals like I've done down around Etruria. Makes a big difference to getting my pottery down to my showroom in London. So they weren't in direct competition for the things that they were prepared to talk about. And for many, many years, unminuted, they helped each other along. The Age of Enlightenment. Mixing art and industry together. Such an important ingredient to Birmingham's success. And marketing and public relations. We invented it in the Industrial Revolution in Birmingham. Matthew Bolton had factory tours, and the Elkingtons, as you'll see, had them as well. This is something that in my book on the Elkingtons I call the Birmingham Way, and it still exists if you care to look for it today. The family, the Colmores, living in Newhall, as you can see on this slide. If you see the canal coming in, just north of the canal, I've shown Newhall. And then Newhall Street, you can actually see, is marked on this map, and we're now talking about 1778. The first canal that came into Birmingham, paid for by private shareholders, the industrialists of the town, wanted the canal to come to the wharf at the bottom of the map, below Centenary Square as of today, right underneath where HSBC Bank is now. That's the way they wanted to go. But the Colmore family, who owned a lovely estate with Newhall being their family home, had legged it. They'd gone to London. I always say to my kids, if you're in London, always come back to Birmingham. 1-bedroom flat in London, 4-bedroom detached in Solihull. It's no sort of difficulty making that decision. But they went to London, and Charles Colmore looked back on Birmingham and he said, look at that city, that town to be a city actually, that town of Birmingham. That town of Birmingham is expanding so fast, they'll want the land that's my former estate, and he wanted to sell it off in lots. And he got the canal, the original canal, the Birmingham Canal Navigation, to come into his estate so that it could increase the rental of the 60 or 80-year leases. And the toy makers of Birmingham filled that part of the estate, the first part nearest the town, with toy makers' houses. Toy makers where they had a family home and a small business incorporated. The family fire, the hearth, would be used for heating the house, for cooking, and for melting metal. This is just about the only picture of them, because there's none existing anymore. This is Birmingham. We knocked them all down and went on to new stuff when the leases came up. They had very tall chimneys were Georgian houses, but not sort of townhouses like you'd see in St. Paul's Square. Let's talk about the Elkingtons then. The introduction, the way we've seen the Industrial Revolution start. We're going to go to early Elkington now. We're going to go to a guy called James, and he married into a jewellery quarter family. And he came to live in Birmingham in St. Paul's Square, the second phase of the Colmores' sell-off of their estate, where they built a fine Georgian square that soon got taken over for industry. James came from Princethorpe, which is a small village at the time between Nuneaton and Coventry. And in 1801, his son, George, was born. And there is George. That's actually a painting in the Museum and Art Gallery, and that was, I think, done, that oil painting, shortly after George died. He came to St. Paul's Square to a house very similar to these here that are still in the square. The house George was brought up in with his father James actually doesn't exist anymore. And James, George's dad, his little bit of the toy industry was metal glasses frames. I've got some, not Elkington ones, but similar to. So silver wired glasses frames. A Birmingham toy, if you like. George's uncles lived across the square, and they were manufacturing silversmiths. They had a showroom in London. They could follow the fashions closely in London and quickly turn production to what was selling in London. A very clever business model. Equivalent today, I guess, to having your manufactory in China and very quickly being able to swap production to whatever the new trends were in the London or Paris Fashion Week, etc. The backstory to the family was inventive. If you go back to Kingsford, then Joseph Elkington actually was quite well known for designing a way of making our land drained and fit for farming. He worked out a way of getting in and releasing water that was waterlogging land. And so they had a bit of a history to inventiveness in the Elkington family. George became an apprentice to his dad in the manufacture of glasses, and he also worked in the silversmithing industry. The Richards family living just across the square. George himself, in his 30s, early 30s, took out patents for improved glasses. And there were two elements to it. One, the shape of the lens, which actually carried on into National Health Service glasses in the 20th century. And then the second one, you'll see on the right-hand figure on the slide, he put hinges down the middle of bifocal glasses so that you could angle them so that when you looked ahead, you were looking straight through the lens, and when you were looking down to read, you were looking straight through the lens as well. Didn't necessarily do that well, but it just shows that it was the Birmingham way. If you've made an improvement to something, protect it, and then get on and hit it hard in manufacturing. The history in Birmingham then of fine jewellery and elegant manufactured goods went back a long way. Again, in Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, these beautiful Blue John and ormolu items. And not everything can be made out of solid gold or silver. So traditional plating, to do something like these fine ormolu, would be a process whereby you ground up some gold, mixed it with mercury, painted the amalgam on to the item, the candlestick, whatever, and then revved up your family fire, put your item on the fire in the back of the family home, burnt off the mercury, and if you got the conditions right, you were left with a stunning piece of ormolu. There was a physician in Birmingham, a children's physician. His name was John Darwell, and his thesis that he submitted to the University of Edinburgh said, artisan disease. It's not possible to enumerate them all. Immoderate toil, well, we know about that today, don't we? Muscular effort, posture, excessive light and noise, irritation of stone dust. Look at the last one. Chemical irritation. This was a design of something to try and mitigate the chemical irritation of the toy makers of Birmingham. They were starting to realise they were poisoning themselves with heavy metals, mercury, cadmium, etc. They burnt off the mercury. It's the worst way of poisoning yourself, gaseous mercury. And they were breathing it in, and they were getting the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, which started probably with a stomach cramp, and then went on to peripheral nervous issues, and then finally, central nervous system. I don't think it's a surprise that the mental asylum, as it was called in Victorian times, was based right next to the Jewellery Quarter. It's where all the action was. In Paris, you know, where they did a lot of work with burning off mercury, the fish all died in the Seine, and a lot of people had the palsy caused by the plating process. So Elkington's George, now with his cousin Henry, who'd come to join him, could see that we were successful but unsustainable in what we did, because the whole town was getting poisoned, in my opinion, to an extent. Precious metal salts in hot solution was the way they tried to take things forward. And this is their first factory in Newhall Street, the original building, 1837-ish. And they offered plating to the Jewellery Quarter trade using a hot solution process in baths. And they took out patents, Henry actually, more than George, and they licensed their patents. They were called La Liqueur Elkington in Paris. They had to go to Paris, mind, to take the platers of Paris to court because they kept forgetting to pay for the royalties of the patents. But that's more a legal story than a story for now. So yes, they invented electroplating. Seems simple now, doesn't it? A solution, a salt containing the thing you want to plate, a battery, a DC current provided, a anode of the material in its simplest form, and then on the cathode, the thing you want to plate. And the flow of ions leading, if you get the conditions right, to a nice plated object. The beauty of what the Elkingtons did wasn't particularly in inventing the one process all themselves. It was in seeing the practical need for something and then bringing together the many inventions of others around them. Voltaire's pile, Padua, 1799. Faraday, that South London bookbinder, who did so much in chemistry, electrochemistry, in 1812. His observation that plating was happening in some of his experiments. And then John Daniel from King's College London, who really produced a form of DC electricity that could power the electroplating process. And in September 1840, after 6 months of lodging the patent, they filed their patent number 8447. They were helped now by other people in the jewellery quarter. Alexander Parkes, employed doing something else in the jewellery quarter, was taken on to take the original idea in March 1840 and add experiments that would show that it worked. Dr. John Wright, a physician from Bawdsley Green. Actually, he was a surgeon from Bawdsley Green, and he experimented in the evenings with all sorts of salt solutions, and he realized that adding potassium cyanide to the solution gave much better and controllable plating. And they added that to the patent not long before it was finalized. These were people that were prepared to share their inventions with people that they knew could really help them drive it forward. So they went to Josiah Mason, who was factory, the world's largest producer of pen nibs, but he produced them not under his own name, but under another name, so you don't always realize this. The world's biggest manufacturer of pen nibs, whose Lancaster Street factory, not far from where we are tonight. And they said to Josiah, you know how to take an idea, better mechanical manufacturing of pen nibs, to huge production. Come and take a third share of our business. Not many people do that today. Come and take a third share of our business. Design us an amazing factory where process starts and finishes, and out the door goes huge volumes of product. And then Woolridge, in the jewellery quarter as well, designed a generator. He came to them and offered them a generator for huge money. The Elkingtons said, absolutely no way. In the end, he came back with a more reasonable offer, and they took it on board. And then they went and found the best designers they could around Europe to come to work in Newell Street. People like Christopher Dresser, whose item here, one of a number of items in my book. Christopher Dresser, the acclaimed lead designer in Victorian times of industrial metalware and ceramics. So these were people that had the Birmingham way. They built a huge factory. In fact, that's two factories side by side. The one on the left is the Newell Street factory. The blue line, that's the canal running through it. So they were so desperate for space, they built the other side of the factory and linked it with bridges. Josiah Mason said to them, the big fancy stuff you're doing for people's centerpieces in the Victorian aristocrats' tables, fine, but it won't make any money worth talking about. This is where we'll make the money. Knives, forks, spoons. And the factory on the right, the Brearley Street factory, that was the knife, fork and spoon factory. Small, economic items made in huge volume. That was what they realized they needed to be successful financially. They still carried on, of course, doing the finer things. And of the two, Henry was the one who took the more artistic side, I think, to the business forward. So the spoons and Josiah Mason. Josiah Mason, as I'm sure you know, went on to give money, £200,000 for the setting up of Mason College in Edmund Street, which led, of course, on under Joseph Chamberlain to what we know now as the University of Birmingham. So, the Birmingham way, new ideas and inventions, multidisciplinary teams, bringing in people who could really help take you forward, protecting your intellectual property, bringing together the skills required, an emphasis on design, marketing and public relations. They even sort of traded each other's houses. So Woodbrook down there on the bottom of the picture, Woodbrook was taken by me for the book a year or two ago. It's now a international Quaker centre in Selly Oak on the top of the hill as you go down towards Bournemouth. Was originally built for Josiah Mason. When he thought, well, I've got far more money than this house, and moved on, he sold it to George Elkington. And of course, when Elkington family didn't need it anymore, they sold it to the Cadburys. And then the Cadburys handed it over to the Quakers. This is one of the big plating rooms in the Newell Street factory, and you can see the Woolwich generator there right in the middle, and then you've got a different bath for every different plating process. So maybe you'll have one for nickel, one for silver, one for gold, etc. And here's the Woolwich generator, which is about 100 feet from where I'm standing, as it's part of the collection here in the Think Tank Museum. So, art manufacturers, they didn't just do plating. They did electrotyping or electroforming, as it's known as well. And I've got an example of an electroform to show you. So this plate is an example of an electrotype. And if you look at the diagram, top left, you've borrowed from maybe the Louvre in Paris a fine piece of 15th century metalwork. Lovely piece of pewter. You take a mold of it with a rubber solution, remove the object. If your rubber solution's worked well, you then can paint the mold with a conductive coating, graphite solution. You then put that in as your electrode, and you turn on your battery, and copper now will deposit and form a new piece. So the top of this piece here is an electroform, and it's been screwed to a base, which is a standard piece of silver-plated pressing. You've got the most amazing fine detail. And in fact, Alexander Parks, their sort of head inventor, he had 66 patents to his name in the 10 years he worked at the Newell Street factory. He invented better rubber solutions to help with the moulding, to get the really fine detail that he wanted. He also, of course, invented plastic. And this is a piece of his plastic. Later piece, it was renamed xylanite. Alexander Parks wanted a better material than the bone, which was continuously breaking in production. And he took cellulose from wood pulp or from linen and heated it up with nitric acid and alcohol, extracted it, and turned it into the world's first plastic. The Americans didn't like that much. They said celluloid was the world's first plastic. So Alexander Parks took them to court and won. Unfortunately, though, his factory in Homerton on Hackney Marshes had some issues. The process was very flammable. There were a lot of fires. And after 2 years of not very successful production, some new people took the factory on. Very sensibly, they moved it out to Suffolk, and they had their own fire engine. And out in the sticks in Suffolk, it wasn't causing so much controversy. You've all seen an electrotype made in the Newell Street factory. Here's the ladies' singles finalist from last year with the plate that was made as an electrotype in Birmingham. And they made some quite big things as well. They made statues out of electrotypes as well, not just smaller items. So Alexander Parks, another example. Parkazine, when Mr. Parks moved back from it, it was renamed xylanite and continued to be made right through the Art Deco period. Here, some 1930s napkin rings made at the factory. And top right, the Elkingtons used xylanite for manufacturing their handles instead of bone. So the design was so important to the success of the Elkingtons. They would invent baptismal christening presents, apostle spoons, small knives and forks for babies to have as a baptismal gift. And their pattern books, 2 of which are in our archive in the library in Centenary Square. The remaining ones are in the Victoria and Albert Museum's archive and not available to see because that archive's moving from Cromwell Road across to the Olympic Park over the next couple of years. But there's plenty to see if you take the time in the Library of Birmingham. The designers just drawing with pencil on what looked like scraps of paper and then sticking them in to the design books, and then those patterns taken on by people that turn the origination into something that can be processed in the factory. So what happened? Some lovely toast racks. My favorite toast rack. What would you like? White or bread? White or brown bread? Oh, white toast, please. Thick or thin? Wow, that had to be the go-to toast rack of 1887, ladies and gentlemen. So every year a different toast rack, right the way from on the left there, a very early one, 1850s, to in the middle there, the modernity of the 1960s. And of course, the Elkingtons hit a wave. 1840, an invention. 1860, 1870, 1880. What's going on? Bournemouth's got a hotel. Everybody wants a hotel. Brighton's got a hotel. There's a railway, wants fine silver service. Oh, well, the Cunard line wants huge amounts of silver service. They don't want solid silver. We know 10 to 20% of it all ends up in people's handbags. We want silver plate. 10% the cost. Looks just as good on the silver service table. So what happened to the factory? Well, up until the Second World War, they were keeping going in New Hall Street. In the war, like the rest of the jewellery quarter, they converted to wartime production of different types. Lots of the things you could do in the jewellery trade were very useful to wartime production. So, as you probably know, we sort of invented small frequency radar at the University of Birmingham, and we needed an awful lot of circuit boards to put in those Spitfire planes to find those U-boats. So silver soldering, very useful technique in the jewellery quarter, which was why, of course, it was attacked a lot by the German bombers. But after the Second World War, a company in Warsaw purchased the company and moved production to Warsaw. Some of the factory was knocked down at that time over the next 10 years or so, and then some actually retained until much more recently, until 1998 as part of our industrial museum, and then from around 2003 we were knocking it all down and it's been developed into apartments. And as always happens in Birmingham, if you build a new development, you always have a square. So we have now New Hall Square. Some original parts of the factory still exist. So the Whitmore warehouse here, which was actually there before the factory at the back, with what used to be a canal running through the factory. Now it's just a sort of a water feature, but it's got the line of the canal. And in fact, if you go to the edge of the Whitmore warehouse and dig in the stones there, you'll actually find the metal rail protecting the factory, i.e. the edge of the canal. And the tunnel, the New Hall Tunnel. This is back in about 2017. As I started telling this story on Sunday afternoons to plenty of people, plenty of Birmingham people, hardly any of who appreciated that we invented electroplating for the world in this city. And yet they all had a mobile phone full of electroplated components. And here, a small tour on a Sunday afternoon, again, just telling this story because it needs to be told. We're not post-industrial. If you care to look, we still do plenty of things. And here, E.C. Williams are manufacturing or finishing other people's components with electroplating in a high technology way. So in my book, I went into the firm of E.C. Williams and spent a morning just understanding the barrel plating processes that are plating millions of components a week in the jewellery quarter. They're particularly into tin plating, of course, at the moment for the tiny components that are going in the batteries which are going into our cars. And if you don't have good tin plating in those components, that's why your battery's going to fail in the 5 or 6 years life that they're giving them at the moment. Much more traditional plating, you can go and see the Acme whistles being plated. And here, the head of the plating room at J. Hudson Whistles, the guy on the left, the guy on the right's the managing director. I don't think he really knew how to do this too much. And here's some dog whistles just coming out for a second or two for the photo. And you'll see the head of plating is completely wired up there with his red wire used to keep his overall on. We still are the world's biggest manufacturer of brass whistles in the jewellery quarter, and there's 2 examples of plated ones on the left, a nickel-plated whistle from the Acme 58 range, and on the right, a gold-plated whistle made not in China, but in Bar Street in the jewellery quarter. So discovering Birmingham turned into a book, but it's just really showing people stuff that maybe you knew all about, or maybe you didn't. Those 5 at the top didn't. They were a group of professors from around the world. They were professors of industrial heritage, modern industrial history from places like Chicago and elsewhere around the world. So, in the time I've taken, I've told you about the book, Invention and Design, which really, 3 years' work to put down on paper something that I think we've been forgetting as a city. Just one of the things we've been forgetting. And then examples of things that are made. Thank you very much. Jim, I'll answer any questions, obviously.
Yes. Any questions? Says he, shading his eyes a bit.
I've just got one sort of technical question. Normally with silver plating, it's usually on nickel silver, which is a sort of brass, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But I have a couple of knives at home where even the steel blade is silver plated, and I just wondered if you knew anything about how they actually achieve that.
So yeah, German silver doesn't contain any silver. It's an alloy which is mainly copper based, yeah. So if you play directly onto copper, for example, this electroform, by its very nature, an electroform is pure copper because you've made it with a copper, a copper process, building up one iron at a time, that new piece. When you play onto copper, it doesn't adhere as well as it does to German silver, which is why they got that alloy to use as the base. And this would be German silver, 1862, never been replated, and only a tiny little marking on the bottom where it's worn through. So there were several things they did in the early days. One, in the 1840s and 50s, they probably gave it a good old dose. You know, they went a little bit over the top on how much plate they were putting on, and to overcome it. As they got better technology for the actual founding material, then they probably lightened the load of the silver on it. With regard to the knives, then obviously knives, as we get into the 20th century, were made not necessarily with electroplated, they would be stainless steel, the actual knife part of the knife.
What was unusual about these particular couple of knives was actually the blade itself was silver plated, but it obviously was steel, probably not stainless underneath.
Yeah, they were making
the edge, you know,
they made lots and lots of knives that were plated as well.
Thank you very much. You didn't mention anything in your talk about chrome plating. Did Elkingtons do anything in that sort of area?
I'm sure they did do chrome plating. I didn't particularly investigate chrome plating as part of my book. But of course, chrome plating, E.C. Williams, who started in the 1920s, doing plating for other businesses in the jewellery quarter. So their plating started as a plated nickel silver, so silver plating. When they got to the war, they moved production from sort of jewellery type plating to to plating for the war effort. So they were doing what we call protective plating, and that would obviously include chrome plating. After the war, instead of going back to silver plating, they realized with the car manufacturing going through the roof in our city that they were better sticking to plating for protective purposes, so zinc and nickel and chrome, etc.
How thick is the electro formed articles? I imagine it takes some time to build up a reasonable thickness.
You're right. They are thick. I mean, this would be about 4 or 5 millimeters thick. But they were also making statues for the House of Lords, some of which were made by electroforming. So they were making very big items by electroforming. I don't know how long something like this would be in the vat to form a piece like this, or the Venus Rosewater basin that I showed you, the plate for the women's singles finalist. But they made them in numbers. So in fact, they had, for 60 years, they had an agreement with the Victoria and Albert Museum, who went around Europe borrowing the pieces, brought them to London, and they actually set up in London somewhere where they actually did some of the the initial copying, and then they would bring those copies to Birmingham, make multiple copies and stick them in vats. They had an agreement quite often with the people they borrowed the pieces off just to make, say, 10 pieces for educational use. This was a big thing the V&A were doing to try and educate in the arts. And they fell out with the V&A in the end when people said, hang on, you're only supposed to make 10. We've counted up 57, what's going on? And the V&A wrote to the factory and said, sorry, that's your lot. And they asked for all the original molds to be sent back. And they were sent back, they were boxed up and sent back to the V&A. And I met the curator for the collection down at the V&A as part of doing the book. And he said, Jonathan, they were just in the cellars of the V&A. We only opened the boxes about 5 years ago. So.
Presumably the amount of silver was rather less with electroplating than when you used traditional Sheffield plate.
Yeah, so for Sheffield plate, there's an item here actually. This candlewick trimmers here is very early and has got elements of electroplating and Sheffield plating on it. So Sheffield plating was where you basically took a thin, well, a bit like aluminium foil, only silver, and then soldered it on to your component. And the advantage, of course, of electroplating, let's look at this Stilton scoop. So this Stilton scoop, round the edges, there's a beading. This is electroplated, but in the early days, they were a little bit scared about going away from the Sheffield plate styling. So the Sheffield plate styling would have this beading around the edges for the very practical reason that you needed that little bead to hide the sandwich. Because either side, you had a thin silver plate, which had been soldered on, and then in the middle, basically, a copper material. So the beading, they carried the design on because they were getting a lot of criticism. The Sheffield platers really weren't happy with the Elkingtons. Took a long time for the Sheffield firms to actually buy into the patent. In fact, they would go bust rather than buy into the patent, it seemed, in the 1840s. Came to their senses in the end.
Where is the best place we can go and see all these items on display?
Okay, yeah. I actually had a pop-up museum in the Great Western Arcade for the whole of the summer. So July, August and September, I had the world's biggest small item collection of Elkington products in a pop-up museum. I purchased all these items, by the way, on eBay auctions. My wife's wondering when they're going to go back on eBay auctions because she doesn't actually like electroplated ware very much, and it takes up a lot of space in the house. At the moment, my collection isn't on display. If you want to see really amazing collections of Elkington ware, then the Victoria and Albert Museum is where you should head. But nowhere in Birmingham. The Museum and Art Gallery above the Edwardian tea rooms had a display in a couple of cabinets of some nice pieces. But you know what? We've got a pen museum. And the pen industry obviously was the second huge industry, which led to, you know, we dominated the world of pen nib manufacturing for 80 years or so. Around about the same time as the Elkingtons were doing plating, but there's no museum of the invention of electroplating in Birmingham, which is sad.
How do we find out about these tours? I've never heard of them.
Now, how you find out is quite easy. You take the leaflet from the table there called Positively Birmingham Walking Tours, or you can go online, the positivelybirmingham.co.uk website, and you can download it. Simple as that. So. If you want the book, by the way, it's the leaflet for the book's over there. Again, the best way of buying a book these days is online. So you just put the title in and buy it from your chosen online bookstore. Okay.
Well, thank you very
Thank you.
much. It has indeed been an interesting story and fills in some bits for me, having worked in that ex-Elkington factory and knowing a certain amount about it. But it's always great to sit back and listen to the story from somebody who spent a lot more time on it. So thank you very much for that. May we show appreciation in the usual way. Thank you. Right. Things to do at the end. You realise, having accepted the chairmanship, after years of watching other people do it, I'm trying now to remember all the things I had to cover. Do please sign in. Ultimately, I then report the numbers of people at these talks to the Museum and Art Gallery, the Trust overall, because of the need to show that we are pulling our weight. And it's a bit sad this evening, they have been very happy with the numbers we were getting actually attending and the numbers that we're getting online. I'm happy to put the two together in terms of the impact of what we're doing to general knowledge. So the next meeting will be David Hulse giving a talk about the Pentridge steam engine and the model which he's constructed of it. Quite a number of our members have regularly seen David's wonderful models, very highly detailed, very carefully researched, and very much starting from scratch on some of the research rather than picking up second-hand information and taking it through that. So we're quite looking forward to that. The posters that are there at the moment, we're just done to provide a poster with the date and place on it. I will do a slightly better one to be circulated. And then now on, we'll be hoping to get a full programme sorted out for the lectures and get those across. There's a donation box there. It just, anything you can leave, it goes into the more general fund of the Museum and Art Gallery. But from our point of view, it's good because all the posters which go out and publicise our talks, and I get them around various places in the city, they are all paid for by the the Museum Trust, and anything else of that nature which we get to deal with. Thanks to Dan upstairs for the facilities. It's a pity the internet bit hasn't worked, because Dan has been refining that. If you came to lectures 2 or 3 months ago, or back last winter, you'll have known there was masses of kit down here. And Dan's managed to refine that down to put the thing out on the Zoom system. But it's a bit unfortunate that this evening we've had a problem over the electronic links on that thing. So I think that's about it. As you leave to get out, the doors, I hope, are locked, just to stop people wandering in. All you need to do is press the green button between the doors to get out. That just interrupts the mag locks, automatic locking devices, for enough time for you to go through, and they're secure behind you. So I think the final thing is to say we have very good Christmas to everyone. Hopefully a prosperous new year. I don't know whether you can say it will definitely be better than the year just closing, but maybe some of you it will. So thank you very much. Okay.